Hey guys, I wanted to touch base with you before the beginning of this video because I know I had told you that episode 2 was going to be about Kary Mullis's medical innovations and the way that his thought process towards medicine is actually what's being put into use now in this new quote unquote medical revolution that's happening around this CV. But before I can get to that, I really have to drill down on his opinions about HIV and about what his problems were with the HIV equals AIDS equals death hypothesis, because it's just as important as the SARS-CoV-2 equals COVID-19 equals death hypothesis. He's asking the same questions, and in order to do that, I've determined that I'm going to take the documentary The Other Side of AIDS, and I'm going to clip out some of the things from that documentary that had Kary Mullis in it. I already played his interview from that documentary, and I think it's going to be really enlightening about the connection that I'm trying to get you to see. So we're going to do that, and then episode 3 will be about the future of medicine according to Kary Mullis. All right, guys. And so just to see, we're going to explore the HIV equals AIDS equals death hypothesis a little bit further in this documentary, The Other Side of AIDS. And I've clipped it out and I've pulled out some of the important things that I wanted to show. But I want you guys to think about everything that we're watching in this documentary in the context of the CV. All right.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, the probable cause of AIDS has been found, a variant of a known human cancer virus. Second, not only has the agent been identified, but a new process has been developed to mass produce this virus. Thirdly, with discovery of both the virus and this new process, we now have a blood test for AIDS. With the blood test, we can identify AIDS victims with essentially 100% certainty.
Thank you, Secretary.
The first aspect of this that the documentary covers is the psychology behind the sickness, the deaths, the psychology behind the entire idea. And we know that this has been amplified times 100 to include the entire population of the earth. But it had already happened. And I want you to listen to the psychology that this doctor explains. And again, we're doing all this in the context of current events.
Cancer patients have known for a long time, and it's well documented, that many people after getting their prognosis die faster than the cancer actually kills them. And this acceleration is based on their emotions. And when a person is told they're HIV positive, what I see happening is, I invented a term to describe it, the AIDS zone. And to me, the AIDS zone is a collection of very toxic emotional states. And these emotional states are both intense and chronic. So a person's told they're positive, and then they're experiencing intense fear, intense shame, intense guilt, intense feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. And this combination of these intense emotions in and of itself could knock out and undermine their natural defenses. And then I notice a pattern. Within a period of time in the AIDS zone, you would see people and they stopped eating. They stopped sleeping regularly. They stopped taking care of themselves. And you began to notice that there was this pattern emerging where getting sick and dying was the only thing they could think of. Bone pointing is a phenomenon where in Aboriginal groups,
At this point right now, our entire society thinks this way. When elderly people are getting this there was, especially at the beginning of this, isolation and just this assumption of death. Even though the numbers were in the high 90s of survivability, it was this specific target population, these old folks that were expected to just get it and be isolated and pass on. This PhD is about to describe to us bone pointing.
Bone pointing is a phenomenon where in Aboriginal groups, there's a belief that someone in the group has the power of life and death. And if a member of the group breaks a taboo, this person has the power to hex them and kill them by pointing a bone. Now, this bone killed many, many believers. But later on, when the missionaries came and when the Europeans came and these people were conquered, they pointed their bones at the missionaries. They pointed their bones at the soldiers. It had no power, because the power of the bone was in the belief. And what made it work is it wasn't only the individual's belief, it was the whole community, the whole group shared this belief. Well, what I noticed when I started going...
So the crazy thing about it is bone pointing theory is that it's done in reverse now. It's the Western world that has this giant belief system and is dying because of the bone being pointed at them. It is the nations that we know as third world nations that are not affected as much as the rest of the world is. The bone pointing is in reverse.
To the different AIDS organizations like GMHC and the People with AIDS Coalition or Body Positive and other groups like that, was if somebody said, you know, I think I'm going to live, everybody in the group said, you're in denial. You're going to die. And so it seemed to me that the reinforcement came from everywhere they turned. The doctors expected them to die. Their loved ones expected them to die. The people in like situations expected them to die.
I mean, it couldn't be spread. It had to be contained within me and not go on beyond me. And there was a lot, there was a lot of ostracizing of me because of that.
Well, we were so careful. We had to maintain the family integrity, which meant that both Paul and I, her husband and I, had to survive. We could not get the virus. We had to be extremely careful. So when Chris would cut her leg, we'd have to run and put a bandage on it. Don't spread the blood around. Don't let anybody touch it. We wouldn't double dip into a bowl of salsa, afraid that maybe that's the way we can pass it. We bleached everything. Everything got bleached. Everything was always constantly
turned into the neurotics that we hated.
It was insane.
And now this same paranoia that was put onto people with HIV back during this time is now on the entirety of society. She says we became the neurotics that we hated, and the entire society has now done that.
Keep thinking back to that very first time, that fateful time I go into the free clinic to get tested for HIV. I walk in fine, and they tell me, you have a fatal disease. And I thought, it's almost like you go there to get one. It's as if you're fine, then you walk in, and then they tell you, you have a fatal disease, and you're going to die.
Starting from 1986 when I tested, I've always felt perfectly fine. I mean, there have been psychological factors associated with being diagnosed with a fatal illness, but I've never actually felt sick. So I would go to the doctor feeling perfectly healthy, but scared out of my mind because the fact that I would have my blood drawn and they would count my T cells would potentially tell me that I was that much closer to death.
The AIDS test, it's the first time they ran this thing where you don't feel sick, you don't have any idea that you are sick, but you take a test and you fail, and so they tell you you're sick. It was the first time. But now asymptomatic carriers with the CV, they have taken it, and it's solely dependent on a test, a PCR test, to tell you whether or not you're sick, even though you feel perfectly fine.
When you test HIV positive, when you are touched, when you get the positive diagnosis, you're supported by everything and everyone around you to be ill and die. The government gives you welfare and free medical care, and you easily get disability and other programs to help you pay your rent and all that sort of thing. Everyone around you and everything conspires to you being ill and dying, and that this is the path for you, and it's almost a sad, noble path that everyone is very willing to help you walk along as long as you stay on that path and play the role of that victim. Something attractive about giving up. And I see people ready to do it and doing it all the time.
Been covering AIDS for something like 20 years, and for perhaps half of that time I reported it from the conventional orthodox perspective that this was a deadly new virus that was causing this condition and spreading secretly among us, putting at risk everybody who was sexually active. In the last few years, I've come across some different points of view which, to begin with, I found very hard to believe or accept, but I found some space in my very busy work schedule at the London Sunday Times in the early 90s, where I was working as medical and science correspondent, to study the references and the viewpoints being put forward by some doctors and scientists, mainly in the States, who had this questioning viewpoint about HIV's role in AIDS. And gradually, to my amazement, I found that the evidence seemed to suggest that they were much closer to the truth than what I'd been reporting previously. A very heavily referenced review article on the validity of the HIV tests had more or less concluded that they had never been validated. At the time, I didn't quite realize that one of the implications in this article was that HIV itself had never properly been isolated. It was so difficult to isolate and obtain that was the reason why the HIV tests had never been validated, because to validate a diagnostic test according to the classical decent standards, you need to show that patients who test positive with your antibody kit have got the virus in them, and patients who don't test positive are free of the virus. Broadly, that would be how you would establish its validity. And that had never been done, because you can't find this virus in AIDS patients or in HIV-positive patients. Something of a marvel to me how colleagues in the business, who normally would be the first to challenge blatantly exaggerated claims that come from organizations like UNAIDS and the WHO and some of these other major organizations, they're completely uncritically accepted and uncritically reported.
And so here is a journalist from just a few decades ago trying to sound the alarms on the same kind of scientific dogma that we have going now. It is so eerily similar. And what he's about to say is even creepier.
And this is harmful because it's helped, every time these agencies feel that concern about AIDS is beginning to die away in the countries where it's a diminishing problem, they issue new reports with new projections and new exaggerated claims to try to keep the funds flowing and keep the concern there.
And that's exactly what's going to go on here, except it's not just about funding with this. It's largely about funding, but it's also about the Great Reset. It's about so many different things at once. This beast has so many tentacles, but the CV is at the core of it. Not that garbage going on at the Capitol building. The CV is at the core of it. So under what this man's saying about HIV/AIDS in the 80s, we should expect new and more exaggerated claims of more and more reasons why the CV is going to need funding, but they're also going to raise those exaggerated claims for reasons like taking privacy away, forcing the jab, etc., etc.
And I can understand this from one perspective, that because they have the mindset that this is such a terrible epidemic, and because they've closed their minds to other ways of thinking, they feel that they're justified in doing this. But it's a dangerous way of behaving, and it's helped to distort the science and maintain some illusory aspects of this for much longer than need have been the case.
Is any of this starting to sound familiar?
Nobody's ever found it in a human being. Think of it. The so-called HIV tests do not detect HIV in a person. They detect your antibodies that react to some proteins that are produced at Abbott Laboratory. They do not find HIV in the person. They find a person's functioning immune system that could react against HIV if it were there. From scientific meetings, from these conferences, from my personal contacts with people in the field, I can tell you that I've found no evidence anywhere that people live longer, better lives who take these anti-HIV drugs, these protease inhibitors, either alone or in cocktails, as compared to a similar group of HIV positive people who do not take these drugs. So I do not know where the evidence is for the claims that you see in the New York Times or in the CNN or wherever you see it, that people are living longer, better lives as a consequence of taking these drugs. Well, I call these the AIDS axioms. AIDS is contagious, AIDS is sexually transmitted, AIDS is caused by HIV, and that the anti-HIV drugs promote health and well-being. The reason I call these axioms is because they're assumed to be true. These four statements are assumed to be true. You cannot find the evidence in the scientific literature that shows that these AIDS axioms are indeed true. The ultimate test that the establishment offers is what's called a co-culture technique, where you take a sample of the individual's blood cells, white blood cells. You cannot find HIV now in this sample. All you have are these blood cells. But then you culture these cells with some special cells that Robert Gallo generated some years ago. You have to throw in some powerful chemicals, phytohemagglutinin or IL-2, for example, to force these cells to do anything. The idea is to wake up the patient cells to start producing RNA, and then this RNA will be coated in a protein, and possibly then there will be viral particles produced in the medium. These viral particles now will go infect the other cells that you added, and then you will amplify by a period of time the replication of these viral particles in the laboratory, what we call in vitro. Now, these particles did not exist in the patient, in the human being, the person that you got the sample from. You created them in the laboratory. And by creating these virus particles in the laboratory, people say they have isolated HIV from a human being. They have not done any such thing.
Millions of people take tests that are referred to as HIV tests. However, the idea that there is a laboratory test that can determine whether or not a person is infected with the virus is simply an illusion. The FDA has never approved a test kit that claims to be used for the purpose of diagnosing HIV infection. One of the distinguishing features of modern science is skepticism, the spirit to challenge other people's work, the spirit to challenge your own work. And I fear that this spirit is disappearing, in particular in the case of HIV and AIDS. Anybody that speaks up against or challenges some of the entrenched paradigms or principles is not only not welcome, but they are strongly criticized to the point of being called names: bigots, homophobes, baby killers, flat earthers, Holocaust deniers. Certainly, this would indicate to me that the spirit of skepticism, the spirit of challenge, the spirit of scientific debate in this field is virtually completely gone.
And this is the field, and this is the field that we're in right now with the CV. This is the field, you know, where Judy Mikovits was sounding the alarm, especially about Gallo and about Fauci. And now I'm going to play, this is a couple of interviews of guys who they are full purveyors of the HIV equals AIDS equals death hypothesis. And I want you to see the religious fervor for which that they speak. All of the questioning PhDs that you've listened to throughout this video or videos, they're all just asking questions in the spirit of science. But the people who are on the other side of this debate, they react entirely different and entirely familiar.
Is it always possible to determine whether someone's infected with HIV?
So you're able to just draw blood out of a person that you suspect is HIV positive and and find HIV virus in their blood?
Yes, even if their HIV RNA is negative, meaning that they don't have any viruses floating in the blood. Even if someone doesn't have any viruses circulating in their blood, they still have cells infected with HIV. And by taking human white blood cells and looking for HIV DNA, we can determine whether the person is actually infected with the viral genetic material, even if they don't have any viruses floating around in the blood. Does that make sense?
In essence, AIDS is advanced HIV infection as opposed to early HIV infection. AIDS is when you're ill, and HIV infection without AIDS is when you're heading towards being ill but you're not ill.
Say that HIV is not the cause of AIDS. Practicing supreme denial. It is amazing how human beings can look at black and call it white, or look at white and call it black. They can look at all this evidence, but if they don't choose to believe it, they don't choose to believe it. Human beings are not rational. They don't operate on logic. They operate on emotions. And that's exactly what those people are doing. They don't want to believe it, so it's not the case. But unfortunately, they are completely 100% wrong. There is no doubt that HIV causes AIDS. The scientific evidence is absolutely overwhelming. But if you choose to ignore it, of course, you can ignore it. Such is the power of the human mind.
And yeah, this is what it looks like here. Check this guy out.
I guess the dissident side raises is that AZT is contraindicated for everyone except pregnant women, children, and people in third world countries. How does that work? What's your response to that?
Well, that's an absolutely ridiculous position. It's totally false. We give AZT all the time to patients with HIV disease.
In monotherapy?
No, we don't use monotherapy ever. We use AZT as part of a combination regimen. But let me ask you something. Do you believe that HIV causes AIDS?
That's the general position. I mean, that seems to be the prevailing wisdom on it.
Do you personally believe that HIV causes AIDS?
I don't have enough information either way, personally.
Are you one of the dissidents?
A dissident? No.
How can you say you don't have enough information if you're doing a documentary on this topic?
I'm forming an opinion based on the information that I gather.
Honestly, Robin, if you're at this meeting, you should have had an opinion formed before coming here.
That's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily true. I mean, I can see that you're a man who stands powerfully behind that idea.
I stand powerfully and passionately behind that idea. And I'm concerned that if you are someone who is going to waffle on this topic, that you will attempt to edit my remarks in a way that will make me look foolish.
I will not do that. I'm not out to take anyone's dignity or anything. I'm trying to put together a series of interviews that bring enlightenment to the subject. That's it.
As far as I'm concerned, and I hope this view is adequately represented, those who attempt to dispel the notion that HIV is the cause of AIDS are perpetrators of death. And I would very much, for one, like to see the Constitution of the United States and similar countries have some means in place that we can charge people who are responsible for endangering public health with charges of endangerment and bring them up on trial. I think that people like Peter Duesberg belong in jail.
And so we've seen that they are on their way to doing that now. You can be completely digitally deleted for going against the medical dogma, and you can have your entire professional life destroyed for going against medical dogma. And they haven't quite gotten to the point of throwing people in jail for having the opposite medical opinion of the establishment. But they're very close to that. At the time this documentary came out, of course this person seemed so far out there and so insane and so militant. But now, what he's saying that he hopes for in the future is coming to fruition. I don't say that word well, so just let me move past it. Now, this, as crazy as that might sound to you, it's about to get crazier with this guy. This is one of the most extreme examples of projection I've ever seen in my life. And evil people do this. They will throw out there and accuse their enemies of what it is specifically they are doing. And this right here made the hair stand up on my arms, honestly. He's not talking about Peter Duisberg or Kary Mullis. He's talking about himself.
One who would perpetrate the notion that HIV is not the cause of AIDS is perhaps motivated by sentiments of pure evil, that such a person may perhaps really want millions of people in Africa and elsewhere to become infected by this virus and go on to die of it. And who knows, maybe there's a hidden agenda behind the thoughts of a madman. Maybe all psychopaths everywhere have ways of getting their views across that are sometimes camouflaged in subterfuge. But I suggest to you that Peter Duisberg is probably the closest thing we have in this world to a scientific psychopath.
There are a lot of other scientists that raise the challenges that he raises.
And now the interview's finished. Thanks.
And now the interview's over. This medical dogma, I had never seen this before. I'm an 80s baby, and so, you know, I was in total fear of HIV/AIDS when I was a child, but I never had seen any of the adult stuff playing out like I have been since I've been going back and looking at this. And the similarities are so striking. It's really quite disturbing. And I'll have a link in the description for The Other Side of AIDS. I think it's an interesting documentary for people to check out. And regardless of what you believe about HIV/AIDS, it is something that would be good for anybody to go and see what the opposing viewpoint is, why it is they think the way that they do, what it is they even think, or what are they claiming, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about what it is they claim. But in the documentary, there was one scene that I thought was particularly good, and I'm going to play that, and then we're going to get back onto Kary Mullis after this, because we're not done yet with the similarities between all of this and what went on with Kary Mullis. We have to talk about his new way of seeing medicine and how it is basically the model that they're using to create new medicines today. But let's listen to this first. I think this is a really powerful few minutes.
For a moment about testing. What are your thoughts on someone going out and getting a quote-unquote AIDS test?
Really, when we say it's an AIDS test, that's a misnomer. It's not a test for AIDS at all. And surprisingly, something that it took me a long time to figure out, it's not even a test for HIV. The test is for antibodies that are supposed to be antibodies to HIV, but they're not. It's a test for non-specific antibodies that may or may not have anything to do with HIV.
And we've talked about this on our channel about the most recent situation with the CV and how the tests don't test for the CV itself, but rather the antibodies, and they are generic antibodies that you could even develop these same antibodies by fighting off the common cold. And so that's what they're testing for. And the situation is the same situation as it was then.
So it's not at all like we're being told, and it's really, when you think about it, if you're told that testing is responsible, it's a pretty irresponsible test to be taking. In 1993 in this country, we adopted a definition that caused the number of AIDS cases to double overnight, and part of that reason was for the first time we began counting people as AIDS victims who were not ill and who did not have any symptoms. They had a low T-cell count.
So she's saying it was the first time in history, and that's all well and good, but now we have the majority of diagnosed CV cases are done with a PCR test, and the majority of people who are quote-unquote positive experience no illness whatsoever, not now or ever. They are asymptomatic carriers, which is another way of saying that they tested positive for nonspecific CV antibodies in their body that could develop over any CV. They never got sick, they never felt ill, and the numbers of new cases were able to blow through the roof because we're counting on a PCR test that is very well proven that it cannot be used to determine illness or even the rate of infection for that matter. And in the meantime, we're also assigning CV diagnosis to patients in emergency rooms and hospitals without tests. Amazing.
And that's only one low T cell count. And T cells are something that can fluctuate 100% in a given day. So based on a low T cell count, that year the number of AIDS cases doubled overnight. And with that definition, there have been 182,000 Americans who are not ill, diagnosed with AIDS, who would not have AIDS if they moved to Canada, because in Canada they don't recognize that T cell definition as a criteria for having an AIDS diagnosis.
And so what she's explaining to us right there is how back during the AIDS epidemic, they were able to use a different definition of the condition in order to bring thousands of new patients into the fold. The number, I think she said 182,000 AIDS patients that overnight became AIDS patients because of the changing of a definition. And those 182,000 patients would not be considered AIDS patients in Canada based off of this change in definition alone. They were able to manufacture that number by changing the definition. And these are the seeds of the trees that would later grow to become what we're watching unfold in our world right now. The signs were there back then.
Test, but it's not a test for AIDS, and it's called an HIV test, but it's not a test for HIV. And we have a series of problems that we are calling AIDS, but that doesn't elevate AIDS into a disease. I don't know if you read magazines lately, there's a lot of ads for pharmaceutical drugs lately. These pharmaceutical companies are marketing more and more direct to consumers and encouraging you to ask your doctor for the remedy of the day. And I noticed that there's a lot of these syndromes popping up, like social anxiety disorder or SAD. I mean, you can make a syndrome out of anything you want, basically, and then find medicines to sell to make people better from it. And AIDS is not that, ludicrously simple, but it is, in a sense, just as constructed. It's a construct. It's a category of other problems, some of which were occurring in greater numbers in a very small subset of people here in the U.S. and other parts of the world, that became, due to the social, political, medical phenomenon that has become untouchable and sacred. I'll read 4 things that you can find on the back of these drug ads, where the front has handsome tan men climbing up mountains in short shorts and smiling women and all this stuff. On the back it says stuff like, "At this time there is no evidence that Zyogen will help you live longer or have fewer of the medical problems associated with AIDS. It is not yet known whether Crixivan will extend your life or reduce your chances of getting illnesses associated with HIV. At present, there are no results, none, from controlled clinical trials evaluating the effects of Viramune on the incidence of opportunistic infections or survival." And finally, there's one that simply says, "There have been no clinical trials conducted with Combivir." If these drugs were showing health benefits, which has not appeared in the form of long-term controlled scientific studies published in the medical literature, the drug companies would be putting the good news on the front page instead of putting these disclaimers on the back page. I can pull up scientific studies left and right that have been condemning these popular drugs now for more than a year. But by the time it filters down to the people who believe they need them, for many of them, it's too late. Questioning is healthy. Questioning is what leads to answers. Science, research, investigation of any kind begins with questions. And when we restrict where those questions can go, who can ask them, and under what circumstances. We're restricting progress and knowledge. And when we're looking for answers to a problem that is unresolved, that has caused a tremendous human suffering on many levels, lives being lost, lives being forever changed, people commit suicide, have abortions, break up relationships, give up careers, and all kinds of things based on the idea that HIV causes AIDS, we have the right to question this.
At the time of the recording of this video, you had the right to question. I don't believe you do anymore.
Questioning is a good thing, and we should be joining hands. There shouldn't be this my side, your side. We should be joining hands, the so-called mainstream AIDS organizations with the so-called alternative AIDS organizations like ours, in an effort to explain the anomalies, to fill in the gaping holes in our knowledge, and to embrace what we don't understand in order to come to some answers and solutions that can truly be of help to people.
I really highly suggest you just rewind it and listen to her all over again. And because when she hits topic after topic after topic after topic, starting with the BS around testing, to asymptomatic carriers, to untested drugs, every single issue that she was fighting against back in the 80s and 90s, fighting against the HIV AIDS equals death narrative, could be the exact same fight that needs to be fought today. Can we question science? Why has science become a religion? All the things that she's talking about are so extremely relevant that there's no way that it's this coincidental that HIV, AIDS, and the CV have so much in common. They shouldn't have this much in common, but they do. So that's almost a bunny trail. We really need to talk about Kary Mullis and the future of medicine. And in the next episode, we are going to look at the future of medicine through the eyes of Kary Mullis. We're going to look at pieces of some TED Talks he did and pieces of a Google Talk that he did where he described very clearly what he envisioned as the future of biochemistry and medicine. That will be in episode 3. In episode 1, I hope I was able to establish why it was that it was imperative for Kary Mullis to have passed away in August of 2019 before this entire thing could have happened. Showed you what questions he was asking about the HIV equals AIDS equals death hypothesis that you could ask about the same situation we're going through now. The same problems that were in academia, in the scientific community, in the journals, and in the media. The problem with how funding is done, and all of the same things. Episode 1, we learned how they were able to bring a bunch of other diseases underneath the umbrella of both HIV and CV. Episode 2, now we've done episode 2, I hope you've got a better understanding of how I'm trying to compare HIV and the CV, which obviously there are different in many ways, but I'm looking at it from more of a social perception management point of view, because this is all perception management. When she said earlier that it was a construct, she's very much right. HIV is real. But the entire construct that was built around it is what she was trying to point out. And we're in the same situation now. Of course, there is a CV. We knew about CVs for years and years. The construct that's being built around it in order to usher in the Great Reset is what people are trying to point out. So this is the end of episode 2, guys. Episode 3 will be back to Kary Mullis and the future of medicine as he saw it, and how strangely it looks an awful lot like the current medicine they're using to treat the CV. Alright, y'all. Like, share, sub the channel. Peace.